Hi, this is Dr. Nadine Rothschild-Sullivan, and in our series on social stratification by race, on our series, which is part of critical race theory, as we look at this, I want to talk on this video about lynching in America, about the history of lynching in the United States. It's important in a number of things to be recognized. It is important to recognize, as Brian Stevenson has said, that we are a post-genocide society. It's simply the fact that this was an occupied landmass as European colonizers came here, whether they came from England or Spain or France. This was occupied. The Americas, North and South America, the continents of North and South America were occupied by other human beings from the top to the bottom, right? From the tip of the north to the tip of the south. And so in that space, it's important to recognize that that this land that we are currently inhabiting was indigenous land, and that there was a genocide committed to remove the overwhelming majority of those who were already here. And, not arguing here about your exact definition of genocide, just saying that there were 50 to 100 million people at the time of white colonization, most of whom died, some of them, as Jared Diamond has argued, by germs, and some of them by guns, right? And so intentional and unintentional mass murder and removal of those who were here. I spoke in a different video about, I've already addressed some other issues. I addressed the racial cleansing in a prior video, the one just before this, where I talked about this, the intentional removal of African Americans from a third of the landmass of the United States post-Civil War. I have not fully addressed the intentional removal of the indigenous populations, but that predated and preceded the African American and white or European American occupation of those spaces, and then the removal later. So just, okay. Lynching by definition, let's just go there. So lynching is a public killing without due process. It is by usually more than one actor, right? It's not a, I'm mad at you, we had a fight in the situation. It is without due process. It often involved extreme brutality, including, trigger warning for reality here, torture, mutilation, decapitation, and desecration. Some victims of lynching were burned alive. It is a form, it can be lynching, both if it's vigilante violence in the fact that, this is not a duly authorized actor for the law. It's also lynching if it's police violence or state violence, that is, this individual or part of this crowd committing this act is, as in the conviction of Derek Chauvin for the actually lynching death of George Floyd in front of us in May of 2020. That, even though this is a state actor, it's a police officer, that he's got duly authorized to some things, there's no conviction, there's no death sentence, there's no trial, there's no prosecution. He was not authorized to murder George Floyd, to lynch him. So it is, whether it's police or mob violence, it's still this public execution without due process. I am quoting now from the NAACP.org website. A typical lynching involved a criminal accusation, an arrest, and the assembly of a mob. Doesn't always involve a criminal accusation, but it often does. An arrest and the assembly of a mob. So, but the due process has not carried out, right? So even if George Floyd had been taken back to the station and accused, arrested, booked, then a lot of lynchings, the process had gotten that far historically, and then somebody would be taken back out of the jail by a mob, right? So in the assembly of a mob, in the case of George Floyd, it was a handful of cops, but it was 4 of them actively involved on scene, 3 of them restraining him, 1 of them restraining by witnesses and bystanders. So it was followed by seizure, physical torment, and murder of the victim. Lynchings were often public spectacles attended by the white community in celebration of white supremacy. Photos of lynchings were often sold as souvenir postcards, and you can go to the history of lynching in America at NAACP.org. In Lynch Law, a book written in 1905 by scholar James Cutler, it stated that lynching is a criminal practice which is peculiar to the United States. Most of the lynchings historically in the United States were by hanging or shooting or both. However, many were of a more hideous nature: burning at the stake, maiming, dismemberment, castration, and other brutal methods of physical torture. Lynching, therefore, was a cruel combination of racism and sadism, which was utilized primarily to sustain the caste system in the South. That is from the Yale University website, teachersinstitute.yale.edu. So quoting again, Brian Stevenson is a lawyer who founded the Equal Justice Initiative. He has fought for the release from death row of prisoners wrongly convicted and sought to prove, especially as DNA evidence has become more available to us, to be able to prove some, people innocent who have been put on death row and to fight for their lives. He also founded through the Equal Justice Initiative, they have founded a museum about lynching, because as he points out in one of the videos where he's speaking, he points out that he grew up in the South where the Confederacy was memorialized all around him, where there were, statues and monuments and things, schools named after leaders of those who had rebelled against the Union of the United States, and who also had done so to fight for the ongoing enslavement of his ancestors, his direct ancestors, only a handful of generations back, right? If you're Brian Stevenson's age, these were likely your great-great-grandparents that were enslaved. So, it's really not that long ago. But anyway, so he at the Equal Justice Initiative, they have teased apart different kinds of lynching to come up with the number I'm about to cite. So they have culled out of this data the lynchings of those who were not of minority groups, and for whom, while this individual may have been lynched, there was not a terror message being sent to their entire community in this way, and also where there was actual, so let me read his own definition, because I'm going to trip myself up here. So it is important to recognize that lynching is underreported. Our statistics are inherently flawed. They are less than the real amount. They're definitively not more. We're not counting higher, but there was no formal tracking, right? If a mob is about to kill somebody, and instead of allowing the court system to take the criminal justice system to go through its process, and instead a mob is jumping in, pulling somebody out of jail and killing them, in the public park or square in the center of town in broad daylight, they're still not keeping a formal record of this. But there were those who did their best. So there has been an effort ongoingly and at the time to have a recovery and a collection of incidents from newspapers and postcards, and those postcards they took of lynchings and sent around that white people bragged about what they'd done, and also reports from survivors. In 1919, the NAACP published 30 years of lynching in the United States, where they documented lynching from 1889 through 1919, promoting the awareness of the scope of the lynching. So that data is available, and it offers the gruesome facts by number, year, state, color, sex, and alleged offense. There were others who were collecting the data as well. Sociologists who were collecting data through those years of the late 1800s, early and mid 1900s, who were doing that. There are only, according to the Equal Justice Initiative and the NAACP website, there are only 7 states with no recorded lynchings at this moment. That may change. It doesn't mean there weren't lynchings in those states. It means they weren't recorded, but that would be Arizona, Idaho, Maine, Nevada, South Dakota, Vermont, and Wisconsin. You think of 50 states, though, and only 7, so that means 43 states do have recorded lynchings. Of the recorded lynchings, 72% were Black people. Black people and largely male, but not exclusively male, but Black people have been the primary target of lynching in the United States, but they are not the only victims of lynching. There are also times that some whites were lynched for being allies to the Black community, for themselves being anti-racist or anti-lynching, and for standing with Black people in solidarity. There are others also lynching of Indigenous Americans, and also large numbers of lynching of Latinx Americans, especially Mexicans in the Southwest, as we're going back historically across time, also of Asian Americans and of immigrants. So there are numbers so that 72% Black, the rest of that percentage would be made up of these other groups, right? So, but the Equal Justice Initiative has come up with a number for racial terror lynchings. And they argue, we distinguish racial terror lynchings, the subject of this report, from hangings and mob violence that followed some criminal process, or that were committed against non-minorities without the threat of terror. The lynchings we document were acts of terrorism because these murders were carried out with impunity, sometimes in broad daylight, often on the courthouse lawn. These lynchings were not frontier justice because they generally took place in communities where there was a functioning criminal justice system that was deemed too good for African Americans. Terror lynchings were horrific acts of violence whose perpetrators were never held accountable. Indeed, some public spectacle lynchings were attended by the entire white community and conducted as celebratory acts of racial control and domination. Those lynchings were a crude form of punishment. Okay, no, that's a different part. Okay, so the number they came up with were for racial terror lynchings, and they excluded about, they had a number starting at about 8,000. They've included almost 5,000. The number at last count that I found was 4,743 racial terror lynchings from 1882 to 1968, north, south, east, and west. There is a map on the Southern Poverty Law Center's website where you can see where the majority of lynchings took place, but you can see that it involves the United States, in all directions. There are certainly, the map has more red dots in the historic Confederacy than it does in some other parts of the country, but nevertheless, racial lynchings happened, and racial terror lynchings happened across the United States, north, south, east, and west, as I said in that other video, with the outcome of the removal of African Americans from at least a third of the landmass of the United States in these ethnic cleansings or racial cleansings. There were often allegations behind the allegations behind lynchings, right? George Floyd was being accused of having potentially given the cashier a counterfeit $20 bill. If you hand me change and cash and I use it again, I have no idea. He was not accused of being a counterfeiter or of having a press back at his house, but that's not the common story in our history of lynching. In our history of lynching, the allegations would be, so white mobs often use dubious criminal accusations to justify lynchings. A common claim used to lynch Black men was perceived sexual transgression against white women. And again, this is from the NAACP website. Charges of rape were routinely fabricated. These allegations were used to enforce segregation and advance stereotypes of Black men as violent, hypersexual aggressors. Also, hundreds of Black people were lynched based on accusations of other crimes, including murder, arson, robbery, and vagrancy. Vagrancy is not actually a capital offense and never gets the death penalty. Neither does robbery by itself, generally speaking. Murder might, but not. But this is, so they were accused of crimes, not found guilty and sentenced to death and executed by the state. This is different, right? Many victims of lynching were murdered without being accused of any crime. They were killed for violating social customs or racial expectations, such as speaking to white people with less respect than what white people believed they were owed. So lynching did exist before the end of the Civil War. It did exist during slavery. The same kind of violence that was done to a recaptured runaway slave under slavery is often, lynching is a continuation of that physical control through violence. The intent of lynching, especially post-Civil War, is to spread terror well, pre-Civil War, it's to spread to, if someone is being lynched after they've been recaptured as a runaway, the intent is to speak to the entire Black community, you better not run away. But after the end of the Civil War, and there's this spreading of terror, this letting Black people know their place. It's to enforce the ideology of and the hierarchy of white supremacy, politically, economically, and socially. So it serves a purpose, right? So I spoke in a different video about hate crimes, and hate crimes serve that purpose of telling the entire community represented therein that you aren't safe either, that we don't want you, you don't like you, you're not okay. So with the murder of a person who's gay for being gay sends that message to the whole gay community. If someone is murdered for being a particular, for being an immigrant, it sends a message to all immigrants in the United States. If someone is murdered for being African American, it's sending a message to all Black people, because white people can't tell whether you're a recent person from Ghana or whether you're an African American. It's just, if you're Black, you are in danger if that message is being sent out, right? That's what the message is meant to say. So get what I'm saying? That's what the message is meant to say. Lynching gained momentum during Reconstruction. From 1867 to 1877, it was, beginning to ramp up as African Americans had been freed from the bondages of slavery, and freedmen's associations were beginning to put together schools. They were beginning to build communities. They were beginning to try to find ways to found Black businesses and to move into home ownership. I mean, a lot of stuff was happening in that short window of time, including African Americans running for and getting elected to political office, many getting into state legislatures, and even into the U.S. Congress. So this was backlash, right? Lynching at that moment in time, it becomes backlash to Black advancement. It's white backlash to Black advancement. Whites in positions of power were threatened by Black rise. And so they were getting registered to vote. There were amendments. The 13th Amendment forbids slavery, especially without conviction of a crime, a different discussion. Watch the movie 13th. So that was 1865. In 1868, the 14th Amendment declared that all who were born in the U.S. were citizens from birth, and all who naturalized became citizens. And in 1870, the 15th Amendment gave all male citizens the right to vote, including Black men, did not give any women the right to vote. But so those constitutional amendments were going down, between 1865 and 1870. Also, there's other things going on, right? So there is the Emancipation Proclamation being put into effect. It didn't mean anything until the end of the Civil War, but then there's the Union troops going through and making sure that Southern plantation owners had manumitted their slaves, and making sure that the slaves knew that they were no longer under bondage. And it actually it was Juneteenth was in. So the Emancipation Proclamation went into effect in January 1st, 1863. The war ends in 65. It's June of 60. I think it's June of 1865 when when the slaves in Texas are finally informed. But it's not until a year later, or it's in the Indian territories that had sided with the Confederacy, the African American slaves were not released until 1866. So. But there's political advancement, there's home ownership and business advancement. White people are very, very afraid of it in this point of time. White supremacists, let me put it, white supremacists, not white allies, but white supremacists are very afraid of interracial marriage and biracial children. And so all of that is going on. Lynching comes in as they're also beginning, let's just go there for a minute, from 1865 and 1866, Southern state after Southern state, even during Reconstruction, the Northern troops are still there, but they're passing what are called the Black Codes. And they are what allow for a system of peonage that I'll talk about another time, where you can arrest someone and re-enslave them and use them as underpaid or unpaid labor because they've been arrested and so they pass, bogus things like laws against vagrancy and laws against not having money in your pocket, or, somebody can accuse you of stealing their pig and suddenly you're in prison and without, and your labor is being sold, and often without a trial at this point. So these codes are being passed, and as soon as as Reconstruction is winding down too, the Jim Crow laws are going in state by state by state, almost immediately shutting down Black advancement and shutting down any sort of integration between people groups, between whites and Blacks. So lynching is at one point it gets up to about 150 a year. They are public spectacles, and like executions in medieval times, they were often advertised in newspapers. They drew large crowds of white spectators, including, whole generations of multi-generational families, and often mementos were taken from the scene, including not just photos, but also body parts of the victims. There was a vigilantism on the rise of Southern white men claiming to be protecting their way of life and their white women. And as we near the end of Reconstruction, through that time, as Black men begin to vote in 1870, Black voting is suppressed by violence, as well as by poll taxes and literacy tests. But violence is around the elections. It continues around the vote for Black men, and later for Black men and women, continues all the way up through the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which the teeth were taken out of, and we're trying to put the teeth back into presently, but with the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, but till 1965. So, from 1870 with the 15th Amendment, when Black men could vote, until 1965, so 95 years, there is ongoing depriving of Black men of their right to vote, and then eventually Black men and Black women after 1920, when women could vote. And so this suppression of Black voting and violence as part of that suppression, during the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s, Black activists were attacked and murdered throughout the South, especially those fighting for voting rights. In 1964, if you've seen the film Mississippi Burning, but in 1964, there's the murder of Cheney, Schwerner, and Goodman, of an African-American civil rights worker, and two white Northern college students who had come down to join that fight and had joined in trying to help register African-Americans in Mississippi to vote. And, they are disappeared, and only because two of the victims are white is there any federal government attempt to look for them and to get over the government of Mississippi, which was blocking, looking for anyone Black who went missing, who was disappeared. And so, that kind of breaks open public mainstream consciousness. Also, a middle-aged white woman by the name of Viola Lius, a wife and mother who had gone south to work in that as well, helping to register Black people to vote in Mississippi in 1964, also ends up dead. So just a number of things. There's a white minister, there's a number of white allies, and that disturbs Northern liberals, and helps to bring the civil rights, helps to bring the voting rights law to the table. So, in 1964, Johnson is signing the Civil Rights Act and in 1964, people are dying trying to get registered to vote in Mississippi. And in 1965, basically a year later, in the next year, Johnson is signing the Voting Rights Act. So, but lynchings reached, so there's a compromise to remove the federal troops from the South in 1877, ending Reconstruction. The white Southern Democrats enact the Jim Crow laws to enforce Black second-class status. Lynching reaches a peak in the South from the late 19th through the early 20th century, and often peaked each year at the time whenever it was time for the landowners to settle their accounts with the sharecroppers, to actually allow the sharecroppers to get some money for their year's worth of labor, their year's worth of farm labor, right? The Tuskegee Institute has recorded the lynchings of 3,446 Blacks and 1,297 whites between 1882 and 1968, with the peak occurring in the 1890s at a time of economic stress in the South and increasing political suppression of Blacks. A 5-year study published in in 2015 by the Equal Justice Initiative found that nearly 4,000 Black men, women, and children were lynched in 12 Southern states between 1877 and 1950. Over this period, Georgia led the states in the top number of lynchings. There is Black resistance, and there's Black resistance all along the way. So African Americans mounted resistance to lynching in numerous ways. One, they migrated. So the Great Migration begins to happen at this time. Black Americans flee the South to escape the terror of lynchings. Prior to 1900, 90% of the African American community in the United States is in the South because of the patterns of enforced immigration, of being brought in for, as captives and sold mostly to farms, to plantations. But also, by 1950, 90% of the Black population in the United States is north of the Mason-Dixon line or out west. It's in these, so there's a move to get away from this form of terrorism. It does follow. It is also found in the north, but there's this bulk, you can see on the map, there's this huge amount happening in the south. So African Americans are resisting by moving. And approximately 6 million people fled the American South as refugees and exiles from domestic terror, worried about being bombed and lynched and menaced every day of their lives. That was a quote from Brian Stevenson. 1.5 million African Americans left the South for North and Midwestern cities. And so it was also to get better jobs and education, but it was to flee this mob violence. Intellectuals and journalists in the Black community resisted lynching and all of these other factors by encouraging public education, by organizing active protest and grassroots activism, and by lobbying against lynch mob violence and state and government complicity. They produced and wrote and produced anti-lynching plays and literary works. The NAACP was formed in 1909, and it and related groups organized support from white and Black Americans in the fight against lynching, publicized these injustices, investigated the incidents, kept records, did their best to keep records and some data, fought hard for anti-lynching legislation. In 1918, Congressman I don't know how to say his name, Congressman Dyer of Missouri introduced the first anti-lynching bill known as the Dyer Bill into Congress. The NAACP supported passage of the bill from 1919 onward, though it was defeated by a Senate filibuster, and the NAACP has continued to push for federal anti-lynching legislation. It passed the House again in the last session, and has not passed the Senate, and has not yet come to the floor of the Senate, but along with all of the other things that are currently in 2021, in early June 2021, scheduled to come to the floor of the Senate, the anti-lynching bill is still hanging out there, one of many, many, many bills passed by the House of Representatives, but held up by the Republican minority in the Senate right now, and the one or two Democrats who are also resistant. And so, anyway, so the anti-lynching bill has not passed, and we've been fighting for it since 1918. So 103 years, right? In 1882 to 1968, there were nearly 200 anti-lynching bills introduced in Congress. 3 have passed the House. 7 presidents petitioned Congress to do this, to pass this federal law. None succeeded. They've all been blocked by the Solid South, a delegation of powerful white Southerners in the Senate, which control powerful committee chairmanships and the filibuster. And this would include people like Lindsey Graham and Mitch McConnell, Southern senators who are firmly entrenched in maintaining the system of white supremacy. Activism. Anti-lynching crusaders like Ida B. Wells composed this Black Resistance. Ida B. Wells composed newspaper columns to criticize the atrocities of lynching. In July 1916, W.E.B. Du Bois put out The Crisis, a magazine, and published a photo essay called The Waco Horror that featured brutal images of the lynching of a 17-year-old Black teen in Waco, Texas, named Jesse Washington by a white mob. Du Bois was also able to turn the postcards of Washington's murder against their creators to help energize the anti-lynching movement. African-American women's groups Women's clubs and organizations raised funds, conducted petition drives, letter campaigns, held meetings and demonstrations to highlight this issue of fighting against lynching. All of this ongoing, resistance by the Black community all of this time. So you might think of lynchings as a disgraceful and barbaric practice from the past. The NAACP writes, but they continue to this day. So overwhelmingly, the vast majority of lynchings happened from the end of the Civil War until the mid 20th century. There is the lynching murder of Emmett Till, a 14-year-old Black teen from Chicago whose mother sends him south to Money, Mississippi to spend the summer with his uncle. And he's there with his uncle. He and some cousins go into a store. The white lady, sister-in-law of the owner, there's two brothers and their two wives, and one of them's there, one of the men is there that day and one of the women. And she says that he whistled at her. His mother said that he had a speech impediment. He tended to stutter. She had taught him to whistle to be able to get out of the stutter and move into speaking. We have her word for it, and a couple of the cousins have weighed in a little bit. She has come out recently, in about a year ago, about 2019 or 2020, to say that she lied. And she will not say much more, but she allowed, and so her husband and his brother, and maybe one or two more other white men went to the uncle's house in the middle of the night, ripped Emmett Till out of his bed, took him out into the woods, and from the physical evidence of the trauma of his body, his mother insisted that he have an open casket so everyone could see what had been done to her son. But he was beaten with a pistol. One of his eyes was out of its socket. He was shot in the head. He had a thin wire wrapped around his neck, tied to a cotton gin fan, which is a humongous, heavy metal object. And he and the fan were thrown into the Tallahatchie River. And so the fan was to keep his body weighted and keep him underwater. So it was unusual that he was found. His murder was in 1950. I think it was 55. It might have been 54, but it was in the early 50s or before 50. No, it was somewhere between 53 and 55. But anyway, so Emmett Till is murdered. His body is found, and there's a very public, his mother has to fight to get his body sent back to her in Chicago. They want to bury it in Mississippi, where it will not be, it just would have been, so they wanted to shut that down. But she succeeded at getting his body shipped home and having a public funeral, and pictures of him in his coffin were taken and run in, I think it was Ebony or Jet magazine. I forget which one, but anyway, so it kind of, there's this space. Now we know that for another 10 years and or so, that there's ongoing lynchings of civil rights workers. We still know that there's, the Klan is riding up, there's night riders, they're riding up hooded, they're riding up, setting crosses on fire in people's lawns and shooting in houses. They're, driving Black communities out. We know all of those things are ongoing through this window of time, but lynchings kind of seem to cease, at least in the public mind and imagination. They seem to cease about that point of the end of the civil rights era, about the time Medgar Evers is killed and Martin Luther King is killed and Malcolm X is killed and the Panthers are killed. And then it seems like there was like, oh, this is all better now. We see now that we have cell phones to capture what's going on. We see that there is ongoing police brutality. We were talking about police brutality in the 60s and the 70s, where there's, there's an even, greater conversation and outcry now about police brutality, because that cell phone can capture whatever's going on, and is being used in that way. And so many things that would have just been swept under the rug between the end of the civil rights movement and the era of the pocket computer cell phone, with high-speed internet access from the air, like this 4G onward time. This window So we know that this was happening in those years, but not really seen, so not in the public eye. But we know this continues. We know in 1998, and I spoke about this elsewhere, that James Byrd was chained to the back of a pickup truck by 3 white supremacists who were looking to prove their worth to a neo-Nazi organization, and he was dragged to death on the back roads outside of Jasper, Texas, until he was decapitated, as his head and shoulder were taken off as he hit an open pipe as they were flinging his body side to side. We know that in 2020, Ahmaud Arbery was fatally shot because he was jogging, and 3 white men just decided to shoot him. We know obviously what happened with George Floyd. We know that this lynching goes on. There were a lot of young Black men found, 7 or 8 that I became aware of in the spring and summer of 2020, that were found hanging from trees in public parks in California, one in Philadelphia, and they were written up as suicides. But there were really suspicious factors around these designated suicides, and so this is an ongoing issue. When people say Black Lives Matter, or say her name, because Black women are also killed in incidents of police violence, and have also been among those lynched across time. Certainly when an entire town was being driven out, Black women were killed along with Black men when the mob just went that way, right? What we talked about last time with racial cleansings, air quotes cleansing. But in this window of time, when people say Black Lives Matter, and then somebody else says, but what about me? All lives matter. My white life has always mattered. At least it has always mattered in the sense of my whiteness has never been a problem that would cause me to get killed. There are very, very small numbers of hate crimes against white people for being white. It's not impossible, but it's really statistically infrequent. It is also statistically infrequent for white people to experience the same degree of police brutality or the same likelihood of murder at the hands of police as happens with African Americans and often Latinx Americans. But unless that white person, so in the data I've collected across time of those who were unarmed and murdered by police, when they were not armed, right, and often already restrained. In the collection of that data, those who have been white, who have experienced that kind of violence or death, have been oftentimes mentally ill and or mentally challenged, and therefore not behaving in the way the police officer desired, and then they experienced that too. But generally speaking, white people who are not who don't experience those issues are relatively safe. You might get a ticket for speeding, but you're highly unlikely, if you're white, to be dragged out and thrown on the ground. So anyway, we will resume our talking about racial stratification, or about social stratification by race, as we move forward, but comprehend our society is distinctly stratified in regard to public violence, police violence, mob violence, and execution without a trial and a conviction and a death sentence. But execution, this extrajudicial killing, is a factor of Black life that makes it difficult to go to the grocery store.